Always a pleasure to be joined by Dave Pagnotta from the fourth period. And let's kick things off in Toronto. News about David Kampf coming down the pipe. I look in our YouTube chat. It's one thing that people are asking about. The Leafs kind of clearly need to make a shakeup here, Dave, but what do you think they could do?
Yeah, well, it's tough right now because the injuries are now mounting. They're piling up, quite a bit. Austin Matthews isn't playing tonight. Stolarz is out as well. And they've been scrambling. Like, this is a team that's trying to figure out a little bit of their new identity this season, and it just hasn't clicked consistently by any stretch, for this group. So what happens at that point? Well, Brad Treliving starts to look around a little bit more to see what his options are, and it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of works out for him, because he's looking for a top six guy, which we've known for a while. This goes back to the offseason. And I think the realization that they need a legitimate puck mover from the blue line is starting to sink in a little bit more. And I believe that's something that he's starting to look at as well. But again, we mentioned this in previous weeks. Any big move the Leafs make or try to make is going to have to result in somebody leaving the team. Like, you're going to have to move out money, which might be why we're starting to hear names like Max Domi again, and even Brandon Carlo that I brought up earlier this week, in addition to the Kampfs and the Robertsons, the Yarncrooks, and everybody that's their usual suspects that are out there. But it's getting to the point now where they've got to be a little bit more creative in what they potentially do here, and they're starting to look at what options may be available.
Yeah, understandable, right? The pressure's starting to mount in Toronto, and some other pieces.
Yeah.
I listened to you yesterday talk about Cam Talbot on the DFO show.
Yeah.
Is he a piece that gets? I thought he was a piece that was going to get moved last year. I remember Peter Mrazek getting moved to the wings, and I thought for sure Cam Talbot's getting moved out. It didn't happen. And where does he fit? He has that relationship in Edmonton. Obviously Calvin Pickard hasn't been great this year. Where do we see Cam Talbot end up? Or does it something maybe plays out later in the year?
Probably so. I mean, unless there's a season-ending injury or something of relative significance in that respect, Huts. I think this is going to be a situation where teams are going to wait to see A, how they're doing, and then B, how are the Wings doing, and is there an opportunity for us to pounce on a veteran goaltender who's got that experience, who's been steady. Numbers aren't horrible by any stretch in Detroit, but he doesn't have any no trade protection. And with John Gibson there, is this an avenue that Steve Yzerman is willing to take? We're going to hear other names out of Detroit if they continue to hover, if they're or less. We're going to hear other names out there, but Talbot's an interesting one because of his contractual situation, UFA at the end of the season, and again, no trade protection. Just kind of makes him an easier candidate to be moved. But for teams, whether it's Edmonton or another, and obviously you mentioned the Oilers, and there's familiarity there. I'd be curious to see some of these teams kind of taking a look and poking around to see what Talbot's availability is down the road. They may be doing it now, but I think the sense I'm getting is, well, hold on, we don't want to jump into anything too quickly, but there are teams that are at least starting to make their lists a little bit longer.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that, because a team like Detroit in a bit of a wait-and-see pattern. I've mentioned it now a couple of times on the show, but all but 5 teams in the NHL are 500 or better right now by points percentage. Like, it's just this massive bit of mush. The teams who we kind of view as legit cup contenders are cap strapped. They don't have a lot of money. They'd have to do something, similar like what the Leafs are doing, where you got to move out pieces if you want to bring in pieces. Like, it just feels like a really complicated trade market right now, where, like, if the Leafs wanted to do something that's not just a pure hockey trade where they're going to another team that's maybe sputtering and it's a guy for a guy, like, who do they even have to deal with here? Like, there doesn't look like there's that many sellers outside of like Calgary and Nashville.
Yeah, and that's why it's twofold. That's why we've got so many conversations going on right now, because everybody's trying to just see what their options are, and then B, from the seller's side, from the seller's side of things, teams want to kind of have a gauge of what that marketplace is. It works on both sides. If you're buying, you want to know what the options are and what the costs are potentially going to be. And if you're potentially selling, you want to start to drive up a market. You want to start to drive up that price and drive up that interest and say, we're good now, but let's circle back in December. Let's circle back in January or before the Olympic break or something to that effect. And there are some teams with that Olympic break, with that, what is it, 21, 22 days, 23 days, whatever it is, that there's that gap in games. There are some teams that wouldn't mind. It doesn't mean they'll do it, because again, we've got the trade deadline shortly after, when guys come back. But there's that window where if the player is not going to the Olympics, you've got 3 weeks to acclimate yourself to your new surroundings. You're not just being thrown into the fire, into a brand new environment. You've got time to kind of ease into it. You don't have to necessarily cancel your vacation if you're not going to Olympics. You can still kind of, breathe a little, meet your new teammates, the bulk of them, and then kind of, go from there. So there are teams that are looking at that as a potential window as well, because it just makes that transition that much easier and cleaner because you've got that extra time off. So I'm curious as to see, and this is going to be a later in the season thing, just where teams are at in that type of mentality from that mindset. But for the sellers out there, or potential sellers, they want to know, for Detroit, what options do we have with respect to potentially moving Cam Talbot? Or is it, Kopp or Comfer or Gustafson or, and so on. Some names we already know that are out there, but are we going to drive up that price and that interest and those interest levels later on?
Dave, I never think it's too early. I know it's November, but when we talk about the NHL and we talk about the coaching carousel, right? There's obviously some guys on the hot seat this year. At what point do we start to that become a conversation where we're going to see our first coaching change? Like, what is the vibe you get? Obviously, Nashville, I guess, is the team that kind of lights the board. Buffalo. And then I think Huska and Calgary has a bit more of a leash, and obviously Jim Montgomery, they went out and did him, got him in St. Louis. He got them to the playoffs. But at what point are we sitting here being like, who's the first coach to drop here?
Yeah, Lindy Ruff has, I believe it's his last year of his contract. So there's more flexibility there. Andrew Brunette has another year on his deal. His contract expires after next season. And then I think there's an option. I think it's a team option, not an individual option. But there's one more year on that. Huska just signed his extension. Montgomery, as you said, was just brought in with a nice contract as well. So some teams are being a little bit cognizant of that. How much, these are guaranteed. They still pay them. So do we make that change now? Like from Nashville's perspective, do we make that change and then Barry Trotz comes in to take over for an extent, and then you reevaluate in the offseason? For other teams, you kind of look at that as well. I don't get the sense, either Calgary or St. Louis are going to look to do anything in that regard. Minnesota as well. It's really Nashville because of the expectations that are there. But Nashville's issues aren't exclusive to what's going on behind the bench. Their roster just isn't where they thought it was going to be and as deep as it's going to be. I don't get the sense that there are any teams right now that are just itching to make that type of move. It's a difficult decision, first of all. And there's a lot that goes to it behind the scenes. But, if Nashville really starts to flounder here, then, maybe there's a little bit, and you can't trade everybody, and some of those moves are going to be difficult. You got to at least show your team and your fan base you're doing something. So that might be more of a reasoning / casualty of war scenario than anything right now.
I kind of said with a few of those guys, like if they wanted to get really crazy, you talk about the Soroses and the Forsbergs. I said, you kind of got to plug your nose and get through the year, right? Like how many teams right now, even Stamkos to an extent, although I know production's way down there. What kind of impact would he have on a legit cup contender? That's a legit question. But like, isn't the market for these high cap hits? It'd be way stronger at the end of June or July when contenders have cap space versus right now. Like, you could find someone who'd take Ryan O'Reilly, maybe Jonathan Marchessault, but these higher cap hits, I think you just got to wait it out for the year, don't you?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, if Nashville's not going to retain on anybody, and Stamkos, Marchessault, I believe there is a way for them to accept a move to a top tier contender, but Nashville's going to have to eat. Like there's a lot that goes into it with both of these guys. And yeah, everyone's saying the right thing, and yes, they love Nashville and excuse me and all that. But I just, from a team perspective and from what Barry Trotz has to evaluate, him and Brian Poyle and everybody there, just exactly how much they're going to retain on a contract. Can we maximize a return in Stamkos at a $5 clip as opposed to $8? Are we willing to eat $3 million off that AAV per year and that percentage of his salary for the duration of his contract with 2 more years left? Scenario with Marchessault, who's got another year on top of it. So he's got 3 years left on his contract. How much longer do we want to do this, and how much are we willing to eat in order to facilitate these types of moves as we go through this little rebuild situation that has to be amplified? Remember, Barry Trotz said this last year when things weren't, rolling at the gate. He kind of spoke a little too freely and said, "Look, if it doesn't work, we'll just rebuild. We're going to have to." He said that partially tongue in cheek last year, and then had to come out and say, "No, I didn't. I mean, obviously we want to move forward with these guys." Well, now's kind of the time where they've got to make those types of decisions. And for the big boys, it's how much they're going to retain. O'Reilly, you mentioned, I don't think there's going to, need to be that. I think that even they would argue when they're having their trade discussions that you want him, you're getting him at full pop. But the other guys, those 2 other guys specifically, and Sarwell, if they get, those conversations going, you're getting him at full pop. But the Stamkos and the Marchessaults, that's where Nashville has to make a decision on how much they are willing to eat. And I don't think they're near that stage yet.
Dave, appreciate your time. Thanks for popping on. You can find him at the Fourth Period and the DFO Rundown Insider Edition weekly here on the Daily Faceoff YouTube. We'll chat again next week.
You got it, boys. Later.
Hey, hockey fans, if you enjoyed that video, then make sure you hit the subscribe button right here on the Daily Faceoff YouTube. We have you covered for everything you need. Exclusive interviews on The Sheet with Jeff Merrick, all the latest hockey news on Daily Faceoff Live, and you can always get your morning started with Johnny Lazarus and Colby Cohn on Morning Cup of Hockey. Don't miss a minute. Hit that subscribe button.